It all started with a simple request, a pergola of all things, a modest structure, hardly the kind of thing you'd expect to set the world on fire. Yet for Michael Hayes, a quiet software developer who had always kept to himself, it was the spark that would ignite a legal battle that shook the foundations of Baywood Estates, a wealthy, gated community ruled by a powerful HOA. No one, least of all Michael, had any idea how far things would go. He wasn't just fighting for his backyard anymore. He was up against an iron-fisted organization that had long held the reins of power over every aspect of the residents' lives, and it would take more than just a legal defense to bring them down. Michael wasn't the man they thought he was. He was a quiet storm waiting to be unleashed, and what the HOA didn't realize was that their petty rule enforcement was about to set off a much bigger firestorm of truth. Michael had always been an outsider in Baywood Estates. He was a software developer, the kind of guy who worked from home and didn't socialize much. The other residents of Baywood Estates, wealthy executives and entrepreneurs, rarely even noticed him. His modest home sat quietly in the shadow of the mansions around him, and he was fine with that. Michael wasn't one for flashy displays of wealth or power, preferring a peaceful existence where his work took up most of his time. But when he submitted a request to the HOA to add a small pergola in his backyard, he unknowingly stepped into a battle that would change everything. The HOA was infamous for its tight grip on every aspect of the community. Baywood Estates prided itself on its manicured lawns, uniform houses, and pristine streets. Richard Wallace, the president of the HOA, had been running the show for years, and under his leadership, the rules were enforced with an iron fist. Residents were expected to follow the guidelines to the letter, or else. Michael, however, didn't see it as a big deal. The pergola was small, nothing extravagant. It would fit perfectly in his backyard, enhancing the space without disrupting the neighborhood's aesthetic. But when the HOA rejected his request, with a vague explanation about the structure disrupting the aesthetic flow of the neighborhood, Michael was confused. He'd seen similar structures approved for other properties. Why was his request any different? When he asked for clarification, the HOA gave him no clear answers, simply brushing him off with bureaucratic jargon. That's when Michael began to realize something wasn't right. The rejection wasn't about a pergola, it was about control. The HOA wasn't just there to maintain the neighborhood, they were there to control it. And Michael, who had always kept his head down, was now in their sights. At first, Michael tried to let it go. He thought maybe he could find another way to improve his backyard. But things quickly escalated. Shortly after the pergola rejection, Michael began receiving notices from the HOA accusing him of trivial violations, things that weren't violations at all. A letter about his lawn, stating that a small patch of grass was slightly overgrown, another about an oil stain in his driveway. These were things that most homeowners would never think twice about. Yet the HOA was insistent, sending fine after fine for these minor infractions, and it didn't stop there. As Michael corrected the supposed violations, more fines appeared. Each time he complied, another complaint emerged. It felt like the HOA was intentionally targeting him, trying to push him out or force him to conform. It wasn't long before Michael realized that he wasn't the only one being harassed. He began talking to his neighbors, and many of them revealed they had been subjected to similar treatment by the HOA. Some were too afraid to speak out, while others had already given up, learning to quietly pay the fines and follow the rules, without question. But Michael wasn't going to let this go. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about a small backyard modification or a few fines. This was about the abuse of power, and it wasn't just happening to him. It was happening to everyone in Baywood Estates who didn't fit the HOA's ideal. Michael had always kept to himself, but now he was determined to fight back. He began documenting everything: the fines, the complaints, the violations. He kept a meticulous record of every interaction with the HOA, making sure to collect evidence of their unfair practices. But it wasn't just about the fines. As Michael dug deeper into the HOA's operations, he discovered something far more troubling. The HOA was corrupt. They were using their authority to extort money from residents, to enforce rules that weren't even on the books, and to maintain control over the neighborhood by creating an atmosphere of fear. Michael had been quiet for too long, but now he was ready to expose the truth. The more he researched, the more he realized that the HOA wasn't just an overzealous organization, it was a well-oiled machine of greed, manipulating the system for their own gain. What Michael didn't know, however, was that the HOA had no idea who he really was. He wasn't just a software developer. He had a secret. For years, Michael had worked as an investigative journalist under a pseudonym. He had spent his career exposing corruption, fraud, and abuses of power. His work had given him the tools he needed to navigate the labyrinth of bureaucracy and deceit, and now he was using those skills to take on the HOA. He wasn't just some helpless homeowner. He was a man on a mission, and the HOA was about to learn that they had made a serious mistake by targeting him. Michael's investigation into the HOA's operations was meticulous. He started gathering testimonies from other residents, people who had suffered under the HOA's oppressive rules but were too afraid to speak out. He collected records, photos, and audio recordings of HOA meetings where board members discussed how to target specific residents or fine them for minor issues. The more evidence he gathered, the more certain he became. The HOA wasn't just an overbearing neighborhood group. They were a corrupt organization, exploiting their residents for financial gain. Armed with this evidence, Michael knew it was time to take action. He didn't just want to expose the HOA, he wanted to bring them down, but he had to do it carefully. He began preparing for a legal battle, consulting with lawyers and gathering his evidence to present in court. He wasn't just fighting for his pergola anymore, he was fighting for justice. When the day of the trial arrived, the courtroom was packed. The HOA, led by Richard Wallace, was confident. They had money, power, and the law on their side. They thought they had this case in the bag. But Michael, who had spent months preparing, wasn't intimidated. He knew what he had to do. Richard Wallace began by presenting the HOA's case, arguing that Michael's pergola violated the community's aesthetic standards. He spoke with authority, using legal jargon to try to convince the judge that the HOA's decisions were justified. But Michael wasn't backing down. He stood up, calm but determined, and began presenting his evidence. First, he presented the records, photographs of his backyard, emails between him and the HOA, and letters from neighbors who had suffered under the same oppressive rules. But then came the bombshell. Michael revealed his true identity. He wasn't just a software developer, he was an investigative journalist. He had spent months documenting the HOA's corruption, collecting testimonies from residents, and recording secret meetings. He wasn't just fighting for a small backyard structure, he was fighting for everyone in Baywood Estates who had been bullied, silenced, and forced to comply with the HOA's unfair tactics. The courtroom fell silent as Michael presented his findings, piece by piece. The HOA's arrogance crumbled as the evidence mounted. Richard Wallace, who had once seemed invincible, looked defeated. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. In the end, the judge ruled in Michael's favor. The HOA was fined, and several of its board members, including Richard Wallace, were removed from their positions. The corruption that had plagued Baywood Estates for so long had been exposed. But Michael's victory wasn't just a personal one. He had sparked a movement. More and more residents began speaking out, sharing their stories, and standing up to the HOA. The once feared organization was now under intense scrutiny, and it was forced to change. Michael had taken on the giant and won, not because he was powerful, but because he was determined to fight for what was right. In the end, Baywood Estates was no longer a place ruled by fear and conformity. It had become a community where residents were no longer afraid to speak out, and the HOA was forced to work for the people, not against them. Michael Hayes wasn't just the quiet neighbor anymore. He was a hero, a symbol of how one person, armed with the truth, could bring down even the most powerful of systems. And as Michael walked through the streets of Baywood Estates, he knew that he hadn't just won a legal battle, He had restored justice and fairness to a community that had been ruled by power and greed for far too long.